In the previous episode of History for Wargamers, I was asked by Will from Big Battles Little Worlds what's the real difference between dragoons and the command shots? Because at the first sight, it's not really clear, so I'm here to help you. Commanded shot was detachment of musketeers without the pikes. So basically, on the generic infantry regiment of the time, you have pike block in the center and probably musketeers at the flanks. There were some deviations, most famously the Spanish tercio, and depending if you were deployed in Dutch or more Swedish system, the overall formation could be different, but the generic food unit of the time was pikesmen with the musketeers. Commanded shot was that you take the musketeers from the pikes as some detachments, or at the time of the 30 Years War, there were even some just musketeer regiments without the pikes at the start. And you put them not in the center, where the pikesmen and musketeers were, but at the flanks of your army, where you mix them with the cavalry. It was most famously done by the Swedish under Gustavus Adolphus, because at the time the Swedish army had less cavalry than the Imperials, and we could say even that lesser quality. So this was the thing how to cope with the superior enemy cavalry. You put musketeers there. So with putting the musketeers there between your cavalry, you give them the extra firepower they could need when attacked by the superior enemies. The most famous of the use there could be the Battle of Breitenfeld, where the famous Oppenheim cuirassiers attacked the Swedish flank, but were thrown back by the famous Swedish countersalvo from the command musketeers there, and then countercharged by the Swedish cavalry, which then retreated behind their musketeers, which could then again fire at the charging Imperial cuirassiers, and repeat that until the Imperial cuirassiers broke their morale and fled. We could even look at the primary sources of Robert Monroe, which in his famous book about the 30s War, where he was describing his experience, wrote this. By half three, our cannons a little kissing, the horsemen on both wings charge furiously one another, our horsemen with resolution, evading and losing a pistol, till the enemy has discharged first, and then, at the near distance, our musketeers meeting them with salvo, then our horsemen discharge their pistols, and then charge through them with swords, and at their return, the musketeers were ready again to give the second salvo of muskets among them. The enemy thus valiantly resisted by our horsemen, and cruelly plagued by our platoons of musketeers. You may imagine how soon he would be discouraged after charging twice in this manner and repulsed. So, commanded shots were just way how to upgun your flanks where you have your inferior cavalry. It wasn't war winning strategy, it was the way how to prevent losing. But it wasn't just Swedish innovation, it was used before, and it was even used by the Imperials, even the Spanish tercio, which was or is viewed now by some cumbersome block without any flexibility, detached their musketeers at the Battle of Nordlingen to capture the important hills, so even Spanish used them. Also, you could have this type of command musketeers where before the battle start you deploy them, but after all, it could be used flexibly even in the heat of battle. If we look again at the Battle of Breitenfeld, at the center of the battle, Swedish light cavalry attacked the Imperial Tercio and were not able to break through. which was nothing unusual for horsemen not to be able to break their sail. But the Swedish commander called for reinforcements from the Yellow Brigade, and even in the middle of battle, the commander of the brigade was able to detach some commanded shot there, which helped the horsemen to break the Spanish tercio, Imperial one. So there are, we can say, two types of command shots. Problem, which is seen in wargaming, is that for many wargamers, command shots is seen as something like some skirmishing guys, and that's mostly the fault of 28 mm wargaming, where commanded shot is seen as something like 6 to 8 guys running around, the opposition on the big infantry units. But in reality, commanded shots were still mastered by the companies, so roughly 100 guys. So it's not some skirmishing 5, 6, 8 guys, but it's still full company of musketeers, 100 guys. It's still a full company of 100 musketeers. It's not just few guys running around. And if we look at the orders of battle, again, if we look at the battlefield, in the flanks of the Gustavus's army, there were stations about 2,000 commanded shots. It's a huge number. But if we look at the wargaming rules for the period, I will take a look here at the Pike and Shot, one of the most played rule sets for the period by Warlord games. Commanded Shot and Jazz Musketeers, they have basically the same stats, but for whatever reason, even in the 30 Years War supplement or in generic rulebook, they are just 2 units per army. It's basically nothing. We could say it. You can put one one unit at each flank of your army, and that's it. But in the context of the real battle, we are talking about thousands of troops. And if we look at the Pikeman's Lament, which is also more large skirmish rule set, not like the regimental one, which is Pike and Shot. Commanded Shot here is basically just straight up skirmishers. Is 6 guys, which is hard to hit, skirmish evade rules, which is sort of okay for the overall skirmish size. You could even argue why the pike block is here if you have 50 guys fighting over something. But again, if you look at the rules and you see commanded shot, then you would be like, yeah, 6 guys, skirmishers with hard to hit, evade, some sort of late 19th century type of light infantry at the first sight. But in reality, it would be full one unit of commanded shot would be 100 guys, full company of musketeers, the same as would be in the infantry regiment. Again, they could be hard to hit and skirmish over. Even the infantry regiment could have some skirmish screen, even in the 30 Years War. Even it's nowhere at the scope of the Napoleonic era fighting, but skirmishing exists from the antiquity, well, to this day. Even it's sometimes forgotten by wargamers, but skirmishing was thing. The original infantry regiment musketeer would use terrain for his advantages, not not some commanded shot feature. If we look at the dragoons, they would act basically totally the same as the commanded shot, because after all, dragoon at the time of the 30 Years War or English Civil War was just mounted infantry. The role of dragoon as cavalry could be traced somewhere in the middle of the next century. The dragoon as light cavalry is thing from the 7 Years War, and basically by the time of the Napoleonic era, it was we could say something like medium cavalry between the real light cavalry and the more heavy cavalry. But in the 30s war, it was really just mounted infantry. Even that there are few exceptions that happened, dragoons were not used for the cavalry charges. It was just to ride somewhere and dismount. That even the thing, if you look at the battles, at the page battles of the period, you don't see many dragoons regiment here. It's not because they were not raised, but they were just not used for the battle itself. Because the main role for the dragoon was to scout ahead of the army and go somewhere faster than the main body of the army because they were still mounted, and go and capture crossroad, capture village, forage for supplies, capture hills and other good positions which could be used for artillery or which could be used for some breastwork for the infantry, because dragoons even were carrying on their horses axes and all this sapper stuff, because they were still infantry, they were still mounted laborers, as were famously said about the Gustavus dragoons. So in the pitch battle, there were not really many dragoons. Basically, really, if you look at the robots, you will see two dragoon regiments each on flank, and they were probably used as, we could say, tactical reserve at the second rank at the flank, when if they're needed, they are mounted, so they can be used to fill the gaps or outflanking the enemy positions and stuff like that, which could be done by them quicker than by the dismounted commanded shot. But after all, they were ordered to go and capture the hill, fill the gap, but they would row them on the horses, but dismount before the fighting. There were general rule, we could say, that for the squad of 10 dragoons, 9 would dismount and 1 would stay behind with the horses. And after dismounting, they basically would act as command shot, because it would be infantrymen with arquebus. And we could say in the battle itself, after dismounting, there is basically no difference between commanded musketeer or dismounted dragoon, because it will be, from the moment of that, it will be just guy with the musket. Even by the time of the 30 Years War, dragoons were basically infantry by anything but their horse, because they were grouped by the companies like infantry, not by squadrons or troops at real proper cavalry. By the time of 30 Years War, they were still even wearing shoes, not cavalry riding boots, and this is the time where we could say the cavalry boots were introduced for the dragoons. Sometimes even just the half cut of the real riding boots, but even the even the footwear wouldn't take them at the first glance as cavalry, but still looking at as the infantry. And sometimes they even have more uniform look than cavalry at the time, because they would be given even fabrics for clothing of the uniforms, so they would even look more uniform than the cavalry at the time and more like infantry. And the inferior status of dragoons against the cavalry could be seen even when their payment, which they were paid basically something between half the way between the proper cavalry and the infantrymen, and even the horses were inferior. If something like half the price of the proper cavalry horses, the saddlery was way more cheap than the proper cavalry ones. So they were really wasn't seen as cavalry, but just as infantrymen with the horse. So if we do some quick roundup at the end, commanded shot or commanded musketeer was musketeer detached from the Pike and Shot infantry regiment. mostly used to boost up the firepower of the cavalry. And Dragoon was basically the same thing, but with the horse, but just for transporting and not for a cavalry charge or stuff like that, which Dragoons would do in next century. And on battlefield where battles are, they will basically be, nothing to distinguish between Dragoon and commanded shot. It would be just musketeer shooting at the enemy. We could say skirmishing, and there were really no other tactical differences between them, not in weaponry or anything. So I hope this was helpful, and hopefully see you on the next one.